Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Brian Miller, director at Catalyst Contemporary in Baltimore. Thanks for joining us for the first of two artist talks for our current show called The Foundations of What? This show runs until March 4th. We are open Wednesday through Saturdays, 12 p.m. to 5 p.m., and also by appointment. We are right in Mount Vernon if you haven't been in before. I wanted to take care of a couple of housekeeping things, let you know about shows and some other tidbits. But I also want to recognize that we are joined this evening for the first group of artists, Jose Arellano talking to us from Miami, and Caryn Martin, Giulia Livi, and James Von Miner, all in the Baltimore area. In the background here, working all the technical magic, is our gallery manager and curator, Liz Faust. I just wanted to let you know that after this, the second artist talk is in 2 weeks on Saturday, February 25th at the same time, 5:30 to 6:30. That will be with Geoff Robertson, Kei Ito, Sebastian Martorana, Gard Jones, and Alberto Cavalieri. So it'll be a nice kind of follow-up, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The next show coming up in the gallery opens March 9th. So actually there's two shows. The first is Sedimentary Time, and that is another show with Kei Ito and William Dutterer and Artemis Herber. And these are all charcoal works on paper. A really fascinating show. In the backroom gallery is our first opportunity working with Inocencio Jimenez Chino, who's a Mexican artist, and he makes these beautiful handmade amate papers and paints on them. And he has a book coming out written by Jonathan Ameth, who's a anthropologist here in the Pennsylvania, Maryland area. And this show is a highlight of that book, and really excited to be working with him. Following that will be a duo show with new work from Bonnie Crawford and Sejong Cho in April and May. I just wanted to make a note for those of you that are watching and joining us this evening. If you'd like to pose a question to the group or to any particular artist, while you're watching, there is a comment area, and we will try to get to those comments. Happy to just make an observation or ask a question. So I'd really love to jump right into this and get the conversation going. This show was a really interesting combination of artists. Liz and I wanted to demonstrate the breadth of work that's being done in contemporary 3D materials. I didn't necessarily want to limit it to sculpture. We refer to it as sculpture, but there's certainly 2D posing as 3D and 3D working as on 2 dimensions. We wanted it to be fairly complicated in a sense. There's 2 parts to the show: the work in the front of the gallery and the work in the rear of the gallery. The artists that are speaking with us tonight are all connected in the back room. We titled this talk "Illusions in Perception." The artists are dealing with changing the viewer's perspective, and sometimes deeply, sometimes it's a very visual experience, sometimes it's a very conceptual experience. And I wanted to jump right into the questioning. And Caryn, I'm going to start with you. And what I wanted to ask, and again, this is a conversation between all of us, so you can jump in at any time. How do you start a project? You work in printmaking processes, but how does a project begin for you? I think this will help people understand a little bit more going from getting into 3D processes.
Sure. First, I should say that my process really just start with printmaking. So for a couple of years now, I've been working on tracing paper as a substrate for my printmaking. And that evolved out of some other paperworks that I was creating, where I really felt like tracing paper was a wonderful material to create the illusion of atmosphere. It felt like it was a material that kind of read as a tangible atmosphere. So I always start with a printmaking process, but the interesting thing with the installations and the kind of sculptural works is that a lot of that comes from the material itself, where in the printmaking process, the paper will wrinkle, warp, it'll start to shift in its form. And so over time, I kind of felt like the paper was sort of this is going to sound a little strange, was sort of asking to become sculptural, right? In its material. So the printmaking process is a very loose one where I use block printing ink on plexiglass, and I do a series of marks that refer to landscape and bodies of water. I use multiple sort of applications of water so that the ink eventually evaporates and the prints themselves become very atmospheric looking. And but in terms of these kind of large scale installations like the one in this show, the interesting thing is that one installation tends to feed the next one. So the one that's in the show right now is actually the second iteration. The first piece, Slipstream, was created. It was one of my first. It was one of my first installations with tracing paper, and it was a piece that was a relief but did not engage space. And for this show, I just really wanted to take that piece into the space more directly. And so so the nice thing is that every time I start to manipulate paper, these pieces are temporary, and when I take them down, an idea will come up. Perhaps I want to create oh yeah, thank you, Liz, so much. This is the original Slipstream piece, which came off the wall maybe only about 1.5 feet. So the nice thing is the process feeds itself, essentially. One kind of leads to the next, and usually there is, some type of image or concept that's driving the installation. For example, something like being caught in a current. This piece, I really like that essentially a slipstream is actually being propelled by something else's current. Being caught in a current that's pulled from another source. So I think that really I'm lucky in that the materials kind of drive themselves forward.
There's a very literal organic process that's happening as you're talking about moving from one thing to the next, and that the paper's deciding what to do and helping you push that direction. Yeah. I think that's really interesting because Jose, if you might want to respond to the same question, your work definitely emanates from a different point and almost to the inorganic. Although, I think the geometry and stuff that you deal with is certainly, there's a mathematical nature to it. Maybe you can tell us about how you start on your work. You have to turn your mic on though. Thank you. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Something similar. A lot of times I have some sculptures hanging around on the wall, and I'll, find myself staring at them and reimagining how I could have done it differently, what else I could try. And so basically I'll sit down and I design digitally. I'll sit in front of the computer, and I've got some constraints on how, what I can make, because what I make is an optical illusion. So I've got my formulas and my constraints, and I'll start off with a general idea, and I'll basically start sketching, and I won't like what I'm sketching, and I'll sketch something else, and I won't like what I'm and that process could take, sometimes it's quick, sometimes it takes days. It just, nothing really seems to click. And then all of a sudden something will start clicking. It'll just kind of push me in that direction, and I'll keep kind of expanding on that. And little by little, then there'll come a point in my exploration where I'll have designed something and thought to myself, damn, this is cool. I really need it. and that's pretty much when I finalized it. That's what I'm going to make.
Yeah. Giulia, your work, thank you, Jose. Giulia, your work, I feel like your work in Vons, there's an interesting intersection between both organic, like movement, like curvilinear movement, and geometric work. And so I think the starting point for that is also an interesting thing, because we're looking at tiles that where we may think of something very bathroomy or domestic or something we'd find in the home. But these are not those things. So where do you begin with the work?
Yeah, I kind of start from objects of memory, so objects that I grew up seeing in the spaces in my family's homes, and that was really like the starting point for the work as a whole. And then as I have developed it further, sometimes it's sort of like a form from memory, so less a specific object. And for these pieces, the tile piece that's at Catalyst and some of the other more organic tile pieces that I've been working on, it's been in reference to just like the scalloped edge that was present in a lot of the objects in my grade 8 aunts and uncles' houses, and that like really delicate scalloped edge that you would see on furniture, on tablecloths, on moments of embroidery. And then I'm always interested in like a soft versus hard relationship. And so that's what this piece is sort of concerning, like how can you get that scalloped edge to be something that's domestic and hard, or domestic and soft, and like what are the boundaries between all of those ideas. I don't do a lot of sketching. I'm trying to get better about it, because I like drawing, but I am a little bit too precious with drawing, so that sort of prevents me. Sometimes I draw blueprints, but a lot of the like thinking about the object and how I will construct it just happens in my head.
Do you like that piece that's at Catalyst? Did you start with that curve in mind? Like, did you just cut a piece of board to set as your pattern, or how did that begin?
So that piece was sort of like a second iteration of the piece that Liz showed that was brown and hot pink, and that one was sort of trial and error. I knew that I wanted to get as soft of a curve as I could, using, you know, my limited sculpture knowledge, and trying to figure out how to get that tile to look really, really smooth. And so that was a lot of trial and error with materials. How can I use, how can I make a curved base? How can I source material that has curve to it? And then the Catalyst piece was a similar process, but I was thinking more specifically about the space that you and Liz had given me in the gallery, this long wall, sort of in a corner, and how could I have the object respond to my own ideas about that scalloped edge, but also respond to this specific space.
Yeah. Vaughn, how about you answer that question too? I know, you know, we've had so many conversations about the starting point being, well, like Caryn, like you reuse a lot of work, reuse pieces from other works, scraps come together, but there's also this math component involved. Can you tell us a little bit about how maybe particularly the smaller pieces in the large, what we'll call painting, but is not necessarily a painting, how do those begin? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that I'm intrigued listening to how others have started their work, because I also have a printmaking background. So that process of printmaking has always been a part of all my work, and the idea of working sequentially, you know, that comes out of printmaking. But I also have a kinship with that interest in how things are put together structurally. I started out when some of my earliest art interests came out from my experience building houses for my father. I was working on his construction companies and, putting together buildings, framing, doing concrete work. So that's where my interest in the materials that I work with has come about from. There's concrete and 2x4s and then also just found objects, pieces of bits and pieces that I find as refuse sometimes, and a lot of them are offshoots. I always have people giving me materials that are either scavenged from sources that are construction related. I had a large, when they remodeled some of School 33, I got a bunch of old 2x4s and beams from there and used those in several pieces. So the pieces that are in the show are kind of that part of using bits and pieces from other constructions. I always save tons of stuff because I always find a way of reusing it again.
That's interesting because one of the threads that locks a bit of the work together throughout the whole show, both in the front of the gallery and in the space where you guys are showing together, is this idea of reuse and reusability, and taking other objects and turning them into meaningful things. You can see that with Sebastian Martorana's piece, 7 Words, where he's using a found printer's stone, and reusing that in a very powerful way. And also Gard Jones's work and Geoff Robertson's work, where he literally used the broken pieces of his deconstructed studio when he moved from Baltimore to rebuild another work. And so that's something that's really fascinating. I think just from an art standpoint, I think it's something that's very contemporary. This idea of taking things and restructuring them and finding new ways to use what has been left over to make work. And I see that through a lot of the pieces here. It's just a fascinating connection point. One of the questions I wanted to ask, the concept of this talk is a little bit about illusion, and all of you are kind of creating different illusions with the work. Caryn, yours is this 2D material, but it's this 3D experience. Jose, yours is literally these tessellating things where like you're never really sure if you're looking at a flat object or a 3D, and it changes where you're at. Giulia, your piece, you're like, is this a functional thing? Is this how am I supposed to interpret this object? And Vaughn, yours has always played on me, both in the illusion of space and depth in the piece, and whether this is an abstract piece of art or whether it's almost like a painting of the side of a building at night with something hanging off. Like there's a representational part of it. So I wanted to ask, and maybe Giulia, you could start this part of the conversation. Is there an intention? Do you have an intention to kind of change our mind or to have us look at these objects or think about, say, domestic objects in a different way? Like, where's the starting point for that? Are you trying to direct us in a certain way?
Yeah, I mean, at the start of my work within like a domestic conversation, I was sort of interested in the weirdly functional, and that sort of grew out of my personal experience. I'm actually currently in my childhood home now, which is kind of fun, and I'm surrounded by these objects that my dad collects as a hobby. And these are antiques that are no longer functional for us in 2023. And so that experience of object in a domestic space being usable or not usable has always been sort of at the forefront of my mind. So that the piece in Catalyst, is it a shelf? Is it a piece of plumbing? What is going on there? Is it just a core? Is definitely at the root of the work. I think in terms of perception, something that is going on at Catalyst that I was really excited about, what Caryn and I have been chatting about, is the perception of color. And so even more so, like beyond what is the function of the object. It's how's color functioning in the space, which was super exciting to approach in this gallery specifically because of the really cold lighting that's in the back room. And it just sort of birthed this incredible opportunity to say, you know, how can I think about these lights in a really critical way, in a way that responds to the object? And so while Caryn was installing, I was there with color swatches, trying to figure out, you know, what kind of color illusion or change of perception can I create in this space? So you can see that the yellow of the object reflects back onto the mural of the wall and changes the color of the painting behind. And yeah, that's sort of what I was playing with. And I think having been teaching color theory for a number of years now, I think it's really starting to be an important facet into the object making. And I think it also speaks to that weirdly functional, right? Can we also say an object is weirdly functional or weirdly perceptive? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that the color in there, you know, between your piece back there, literally like changing color and changing the color of the wall. It's a real, very playful and interactive piece, much like Jose's, much also like Gard's piece in the front room, which we'll talk about at the next talk. But it projects light around the floor and into the room, and yours does the same thing. That bright yellow illuminates into other spaces almost when you're standing back in the room. Jose, yours is literally specifically like trying to play on our perceptions, like Giulia's, but you're directly engaging this this play of optics that are literally like playing with the way our brain and our eyes perceive. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of intention?
Well, I think I'm muted.
You're good.
I'm good.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to. I think what I'm reaching for is this this awe, this wonder, this, you know, maybe confusion. How is this working? What's going on here? Definitely trying to, you know, catch somebody off guard. I think the piece that you guys have, it's minimal, it's understated, it's, you know, just a white background. The bottom, it looks like it's gray, but it's actually white. And I think that, you know, the fact that it's kind of minimal and yet can catch somebody off guard and really make them, you know, question, you know, what it is that they're seeing, which is, you know, their perception and how they move, how it changes what they're seeing. And from there, you know, I'd like to foster that wonder and hope that, you know, maybe someone young comes in there and sees it and is like, well, what is this? How does this work? And goes on and starts playing with some other concept in their mind, and maybe eventually they become an artist, which is basically what happened to me. I saw something in this genre at an art fair, and it blew my mind, and I went home immediately and started working on it.
Do you remember what that piece was?
Yeah, I remember. It was actually 10 years ago, almost to the day. The piece is by Patrick Hughes, and it blew my mind. And that night I was in the shed. You know, I had a shed. I had great space to work, and I was using materials that I was familiar with. I was familiar with, you know, car repair stuff, Bondo, fabrics, spandex, and, you know, MDF wood. And I just started stretching and, you know, playing with what I thought was how this thing worked. I took video of it, and yeah, after a couple weeks, there you go. That's good. That's Patrick Hughes there. After a couple weeks, I had my first conceptual prototype and stood back from it. It worked. So it was a hot mess. It was a disaster. I'm sorry I didn't include it on the images to see. but it was proof of concept And from there, it was just, how can I make it better? What can I do differently? And how can I evolve this? How far can I take it? How big can I go? How small can I go? Could you be, flying over an airport and see one?
Well, certainly. I mean, this one example of yours, which is far from understated, it's very engaging in our particular space back there. A lot of your other pieces are extremely colorful, and you've been experimenting with large scale installation, like in situ public space stuff over the last year or so, and really interested to see the direction of those pieces, of course. But the color aspect is also within your work. We're just happen to be looking at a more I'll call like monotype, right, or grayscale type of image. But your work is very colorful in a lot of other works. Caryn or Vaughn, sorry, go ahead.
The interesting with the monochrome, let's say the white pieces, what's interesting about them is it's kind of hard to describe, but imagine if I just put a white cube into a room and I ask you what color it is, you're going to tell me it's white. And there might be, something on the side of it that is blue, and it'll like Giulia's work, it might cast a little blue onto the side of the white. But our brain kind of takes all of that information and lets us know, no, that's the paint on there is white. Because my work is what you would call reverse perspective, where things are kind of backwards. It's kind of easier for us to see that, hey, something's not right here. Why is that blue? Where before, if it were just a cube, you wouldn't even notice that. Now, it doesn't happen so much with the color pieces because it's harder to perceive. But the colors can definitely help me make the illusion easier to grasp, to see, to catch more people off guard. Because I can kind of group certain pieces to make you know that, hey, these pieces are together to form a certain shape.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Caryn or Vaughn, do you want to fill in any information for us? Yeah.
Sure. I really love this conversation about perception in terms of color. And I was thinking about that back room. I really feel like there's quite a bit of a, like, what am I looking at? What am I looking at? And one thing I've always loved about Giulia's work, because she and I had some crossover at Maryland Institute College of Art. So I've been able to see her work through the years. Is for me, I always love this sort of feeling of familiarity and also the uncanny aspect of her work. It's like, yes, I understand this shape, and yet I don't know exactly from where. And to me, it always feels a little bit like an homage to those domestic spaces. But the color play that's happening in her piece right now, it's one of the first things I noticed on opening night. I literally was like, what is happening? With that yellow kicking up onto the bluish purple. And also with Jose's work, seeing it in the documentation and how the white of his piece merges right with the wall. It also feels like it's coming from the wall. With my piece, one thing that's really fascinating for everyone who's done some photography is that in documenting it with the cool lights on, the light source that I have within the piece reads as very warm. As soon as the lights come off and you go to document, that light gets documented as white, as like a pure, cool white. The camera is trying to understand the color temperature. And actually, even your eyes, when you're in there, the color totally shifts when you have that experience of lights on versus lights off. Yeah. So the opening night became almost like a disco experience where we had the lights coming on and off periodically during the opening. And, not only did the light temperature shift, but the color and the kind of perception of the mark making, very different experiences with the lights on and the lights off. And so the perception of the piece is interesting. I think in terms of illusion, because my background is in painting and printmaking, and my first love was landscape painting, I think there's a part of me that's always thinking about illusion, a reference to outdoor spaces, landscape, bodies of water, atmosphere, weather. I'm just really inspired by all of that. And I love this video that Liz took. And yeah, so I think there is a very purposeful reference to the illusion of our natural world happening in the piece. But I also purposefully left some of the edges of the paper, that kind of hard edge, that squared off edge, like some of the paper will drop down and you become very aware that it's paper. And I like that play on illusion and then breaking the illusion. I think the materials bring you back to the space. I think they bring you back to, they kind of break the illusion, you know. So for me, like both things are happening with the piece. But I was particularly, I just thought that was really engaging in terms of like so many of the artists, the literally how you see the piece changes, you know, when you move around the room, when the light shifts. I think that was a really nice connection in this particular group of artists.
Yeah. Vaughn, you were going to chime in there.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about the idea of illusion, and it actually, in the pieces that are in the show, not they're sort of roundabout dealing with it, but since very early on, I began to be really interested in the nature of aesthetics, and the Western aesthetics have been battling with the idea of illusion since Plato. And Plato's allegory of the cave, I think, has been something that has been in the back of my mind for so long, and you know, it manifests itself in so many different conceptual thoughts about the nature of art. That was discussed in the 50s and 60s with the picture plane, and Joseph Kosuth in the 70s, and so the idea of illusion has always been interesting, because Plato has kind of set up this distrust of the senses, which is really what I've been responding to, I think, for years. That idea that art is an illusion and is mimicry, and it's not reality. And so some of it is a real obvious desire to make the pieces that I'm making physically, literally, what they are, you know, as opposed to implying some type of space or that. And sometimes that does happen, but you know, that the physicality of the painting and the physicality of the work is kind of an answer to that idea of the question that Plato put out so so long ago.
Very long ago.
Yes, very long ago. But
Yeah.
you know, it has really dominated so much of Western aesthetics. You know, that his distrust of the senses is really contrary to the nature of what art's all about.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he was, you know, his old theories about the realm of forms, and how essentially that's kind of in some respects what Kosuth was discussing in his essay Art After Philosophy. And Kosuth goes so far as to say that formalism is only minimally art, and it's all about ideas. So, and that really manifests itself from Plato, thinking about Plato's realm of forms as the answer to what reality is all about. And you know, I am much more prone to trust my senses, you know, the physicality of things and vision. There are a wide variety of how we see things. You know, every individual sees things a little differently because of our perceptual dysfunction, or you know, I wear glasses, so my vision is always questionable at times. But you know, I think that sense of things is still essentially what art is all about. It's being able to even if it's an illusion, or you get fooled, that's part of what is interesting about it.
It certainly is. I mean, that's why I love this space in the back that we've created with all of your work. These little, I don't want to say trick, because that's almost diminutive. I mean, and they're very, very smart. And I think they're playing exactly to what you're talking about. I mean, there is an attempt to subvert something in a way, and to get you to literally change your vision, whether it's just an optical illusion or what. It does bring into question how we perceive things, and that for us, I say us, Liz and I, in thinking about all the work in the show, that's kind of what we were thinking about, how all the work in the show is in some way slightly subversive, and to the foundations of so much of our understanding about the world. And that's why the title became The Foundation of What, and what being this sort of new place, this place where we've tried to break down illusions in a way. I'd like to kind of move on to another question. You are all working in sculpture. I think we can agree that all of these pieces have a sculptural element to them. So that makes them three-dimensional objects. I'm curious, Caryn, I already know the answer to this for you, but do any of you also work in 2 dimensions? Specifically, Vaughn, I mean, you do printmaking as well.
Yes.
And one of the reasons I'm asking is because I want to know if constructing an object that has multiple viewpoints, like how do you, this is sort of goes back to the process question, like how do you work with that? So people are going to see the thing from not just straight on. How does that come into the process of constructing and conceiving? And how does that play for those of you that do make 2-dimensional objects? How do those things relate to each other?
Gosh,
How about it?
for me, I was in undergraduate. I was a printmaking sculpture major, so I was working on both, and the physicality of materials was a lot about what drove my interest and my history of working in construction. Just having the materials, and I found an interesting sort of play between what would happen with 2D and 3D imagery, and some of it came out through photography, actually, of looking at. I did a whole series. I don't think they've ever been exhibited, actually, but I did a whole series of photographs of streets, just the imagery that's painted on the streets, and how they would come off of the street and up onto the curbs. So there's always kind of a 3D and 2D relationship to stuff that's on the streets,
Mm-hmm.
and I kind of wove itself into the work I was doing.
Mm. That's fascinating. You're like looking at the 3-dimensional world, taking photographs in the 2 dimensions, and then coming back into 3-dimensional representation of it.
Yeah, it's kind of roundabout, but but interesting.
Yeah, I
Well,
really
so-
like that. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so much of what you do as artists is extraction and reformulation. You dig clay out of the ground. It was made by the earth. You dig it out, you reform it, you use fire or whatever, and you come up with some new form. And you're all doing that in various ways. Caryn, so go ahead.
Liz just found some of my shots on the. I saw some shots go from my website. So.
Yeah.
I can relate to Vaughn's interest in photography too. The frame shifts, of course, whether you're working on canvas, on paper, looking through the lens, or, in my case, I was really thinking about the room as my frame for this piece, which is interesting because with a background in painting, honestly, I was always just getting close and backing up, getting close and backing. My movement while working was just forward and backward. And now that I'm working more sculpturally and really thinking about space for this piece, as I was building it, I was moving around the room, but I was also shifting my perspective in terms of like I would sit, and then I would. I have a really, really tall art friend who as I was building the piece, I thought, okay, periodically I stood on a ladder just like a rung or two higher than my own height, so that I thought, well, what's the experience going to be like for someone who is much taller than I am? What is their view? So there was a lot of movement, in making the piece. And then I think the piece, obviously kind of captures that movement. But, while building it, I was also really thinking about the other artists in the space and how I could create an experience, but I also, I didn't want to be blocking certain viewpoints. So it was a really interesting challenge, but I think I just kept thinking about the room as my frame. If I'm doing a collage on panel, I'm very aware of that rectangle, whether it's a vertical or what the proportions are of it. And so I think with this piece, it just was really kind of a shifting of the frame.
Yeah. I wanted to, if you guys don't mind, I just wanted to interject. I wanted to read a comment that was put in here, and it's by Jed Smalley, who's also one of our artists. He's both a painter and a sculptor, and started out really doing massive sculptural work in the late 70s and early 80s. And I liked his comment about sculpture today being particularly diverse, and that the work that you guys are doing can't really be defined within very specific movement. I think that's very representative of a lot of art, probably. Like, we're at this point where there's like this just absolute infinity of possibilities. We're in the art multiverse, where kind of anything goes as long as you can do it well, and people, and I think that's just to go back to the curatorial perspective. We were looking for that with this show, and I feel like the show certainly demonstrates that. It's funny, a lot of people came in and said, I feel how like the work is so different. All your work is so different. All the work in the front is so very different, but there's something about it that feels extremely connected. And so what Jed is saying is that, is fairly interesting, that there is something underlying that is connecting the work. Hopefully that comes through in Liz and mine's curatorial point of view. But there's quite a diversity of work being made out there. So I just wanted to refer to that comment in there. Jose, did you have a response to that in terms of thinking about you talked a little bit about it in terms of your process, but I mean, it's interesting because you are very specifically trying to get people to think they're looking at a 2D object, but only from one of the perspectives. Whereas from the other perspective, you want them to see that you're working with 3D. So how does that, how do you work with that in the creation? I mean, obviously there's this mathematical and computer part of it, but in thinking about the work, how do you move forward?
Well, that's a great question. I basically go back to, I try to understand how we see things. So you can kind of take like a photograph of, let's say you're on the street and you take a photograph of the street and the view of what you're seeing. You kind of dissect that photo and start realizing that, a building, that how the building is built, the lines are parallel, the walls are parallel to each other. But if you start trying to put rulers on top of this photograph, you're going to start realizing these lines aren't, perfectly parallel anymore because of perspective. So what I try to do is really dissect that part of it so that I can create something that it's obviously, I'm trying to fool someone into believing that they're seeing something that they're not. And if I have a better understanding of how our optics, what we're looking at, then I can go and kind of reverse engineer that to create something that looks more realistic, even though it isn't. It's in reverse. That's where it's kind of like an architectural drawing, where you've got something that's 2-point perspective, Right?
Right.
We've got a bunch of parallel lines and some lines where they converge, a vanishing point. And so what I've done is where we were looking at the works of Patrick Hughes before, in those works, you'll see there's a lot of parallel lines. He's basically working in what would be 2-point perspective. And then what I've done is I've gone and tried to do my work in 3-point perspective. So nowhere on my sculpture are you going to find a parallel line. And then that, that creates a little bit of a different effect in the illusion. But yeah, it goes back to kind of reverse engineering. What is it? How do we see things when we look at something? What is the image like? And the best way that I can do that is kind of like a photograph, kind of trying to figure out, or how can I engineer this thing to all those not that make it look like that.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Real quickly, can you tell us what like the physical production process is like? Just like sum it up for us, because I don't think people know what they're looking at when we're showing them. If they've been into the gallery, they still don't even know really what they're looking at in terms of the materiality.
Yeah, sure. Currently, the sculptures are what I would call a wet layup of gel coat and carbon fiber, similar to what a new a boat would be made out of. Gel coat and say fiberglass. I'm using carbon fiber. I'm using epoxies. And basically my process is I'll first design one and I'll build it by hand out of other materials. It would be like mat board or, an illustration board. I'll cut it and I'll build it and put it together. That serves as a plug, basically, that I'll make a mold out of. So I'll have that original plug that I've built. I'll coat that in silicone. The silicone will harden. And I'll put quite a bit of silicone on it, so it's maybe a 1/4 inch thick, and then that's what I'm creating is basically a mold. Now the mold silicone is going to be floppy, so before I take that off of the plug, I'll coat the silicone in like a cement that kind of creates the mother mold, which holds everything together. And then so once I've got this silicone mold, I can really put anything in it because silicone's wonderful that nothing adheres to it. So I could pour cement into this mold and it would come out. But I like to use light materials.
Pieces are big, but they are very lightweight.
Right. It's carbon fiber. You got to think, bicycles, top of line bicycles, F1 race cars. All these things they're carbon fiber. And I don't know, as a guy, I guess I just kind of like carbon fiber. I think it's a cool material because it's strong, it's light, and it's interesting.
Yeah. I wanted to. There was the comment that Jed Smalley made actually tied into a question that I had, because although maybe we're certainly at this very interesting point in art, I feel like we're always getting to everybody in history. You're always getting to really interesting points in art, but we are at this like extremely diverse. Like there's so many different materials available to use. People are finding trash to turn into artwork. There's very high tech stuff with computers. I'm curious for each of you if there's a thread in art that you feel attached to, either through art history or something contemporary going on. And that ties into Jed's comment that you guys have you're at this moment where there's this explosion of types of work. But there's probably something that you feel more connected to throughout a history, and I'm curious about that. Giulia, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think what Jed said was really astute. I'm glad to hear that he's listening in, because we have this, through digital fabrication, we have a lot of options available to us, but we haven't quite escaped the painting versus sculpture, the 2D versus 3D conversation. My practice was 2D for a long time, and I think what I make now is just like wanting more from painting, and And so it's kind of funny, like when you came to my studio and said we're doing a sculpture show, it seemed so foreign to me to even be under that umbrella. And then making the work, I was like, well, why does that seem foreign to me? You know, like what about the work is even painting anymore? And so I think that the thread for me is that question, like what is painting versus what is sculpture? Because I still think it's a pretty interesting question to be answered. Of course, I feel still pretty tied to the history of painting. For me specifically, my background in mural work has sort of exploded into like, how can I totally change space? And now what I think is most interesting, and I'm sort of answering both questions at once, I guess, but I'm thinking a lot about what Caryn said about the other work in the space. And I think that question of 2D and 3D can sort of relate to what else is happening in a space, you know, like what looks like sculpture when it's surrounded by painting and what looks like painting when it's surrounded by sculpture. And I think that's sort of something that I'm interested in. I'm so, this show, the image that's on the screen now is from an exhibition called Expanded Dialogue that was for artists, and it traveled to 3 different spaces. And so we had 3 opportunities to show together. And that really, I think, started my thinking pretty deeply about what is a group show? Like, how does work respond to space, but respond to other work? And I think that's like the beauty of the group show, the beauty of deciding between, you know, what art thread am I following? I think that's always changing. And there's no real answer, but you have to ground yourself somewhere, right? Like, I teach interdisciplinary studio classes, and that's always a big question for my students. Am I making a painting? And if not, what am I making?
Well, that's like at the heart of your work then. Like that is the thread, is the questioning part. Like,
yeah,
and
totally.
you don't necessarily, like you allow that to lead you through the process of combining, not having it either way, like, oh, I'm working on a painting, I'm working on sculpture. You let that toe the line. Like that is what you're doing, is questioning it, but also answering it through the work. Like your answer is, I don't think it matters whether it's painting or sculpture. It's this object that I've created.
And it was nice seeing the group of the 4 of us in the backspace, because I think, you know, whether that's everyone's main thread, I think everyone is also kind of in some way thinking about that. The work in the backspace now feels so much about what is sculpture, but it also feels about perception and balance. Balance being something that I really see as a common thread between the 4 of us. And so, yeah, like what is material, and how do we find common ground ideas beyond these like umbrellas of material. I don't know. Move on from me.
I know, but I know what you're saying. I totally know what you're saying. You don't in some way, none of you fit under that umbrella.
Yeah.
In a sense. Vaughn, what threads are you connected to? And that's a funny question because you literally have a thread in the painting, but I didn't intend that.
Yeah, no, it's hard to say. It's interesting how I think we all tend to be a product of the times when we begin to, our vision starts to mature, and we start to realize some of the things that interest us as artists. And you know, I think that I started out actually very representational, landscape, really interested in observational drawing, and then I ran into I started taking aesthetics, philosophy classes, and started questioning so much. And I think that at that time frame, it was conceptualism was such a big part of what was going on in the art world. So that, I think, has always dominated what I've been doing, just trying to figure out where I am and what is important to me, and how I interpret the challenges of the questions that come up in the art world. How to respond to different critiques about the work and the direction. So it's that background is hard for me to avoid.
Well, and it is you have a longer career than most of the other artists in there, and you can say that it's hard to escape, but your work certainly has so many diversions, even though there's motifs and things that continue along. And to me, in some sense, the motifs that you've created within your work is that thread that continues, that you're exploring, and you're using that language, not over and over again, but in constantly expanding ways, like the universe kind of expanding out,
Yeah, I think you're right. There's threads that run through it, and it's a combination of observational and also the sort of reductive. I was in college when a lot of minimal ideas were there, and that purity has always been a part of what I find interesting. Just trying to pare things down to the essential.
I like that idea, the idea of purity.
Yeah.
Jose, do you want to connect to that? Is there a thread other than Patrick's work that blew your mind and inspired you, working over the last decade or more? Is there something that that you're attached to, that you feel like the work connects with?
That's hard to say. I feel like people group my work with kind of the op art movement, the Giulia Parts, the Vasarellis. That's fine. I like that work. I like I like the Agam also, but I don't necessarily try to emulate or try to I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm just going on my own path. And if somebody, if they want to say, oh, it's like an optical, sure, it's kind of optical, it's kind of kinetic, but doing my own thing, and however somebody wants to look at it, great.
I think there's an element to that. It's there's something to be said that you're aware of all these things and aware what those crossovers are, but you're not attaching what you're doing to that or letting it affect you. I tell people a lot about the artists that we tend to work with at Catalyst, and how so many of them are extremely aware of what's happening. They're either schooled in art history or they're very into contemporary work, but they're not letting it like they're not trying to emulate it or absorb it or let it affect their work. Very much working in their own directions. And I love that about the work here. I think it's really evident. Of course, there's crossovers. Of course, someone's going to go, oh, well, I think of this work when I see your work, or I think of that. I mean, everyone has ever done that. And there's nothing wrong with that, Caryn, what about you? What about the threads in your work?
Yeah, it's funny because it's like, let me talk about 19th century romantic landscape painting because I think in a lot of ways, I think that my work is emotively driven. It was interesting hearing Vaughn talk about the kind of conceptual. I think that even though I'm using the language of our exterior world and our landscape, my work has always been very much about an internal landscape. I think in one of the descriptions that you all posted, you talked about kind of the inward turning outward, or vice versa. And so I think, even though I have a background in landscape painting, even when I was a very young landscape painter, I would go out on a sunny day and come back with a rainy day painting. it was always, my teacher was a little alarmed, but was like, okay, so I think that there is, of course, a history of landscape being a mirror for the human condition, in relation to the sublime, in relation to our humility in front of kind of this vastness of the world. And now with climate change, I think we've circled back to landscape being a connection with this sort of limitless, but also kind of sometimes terrifying reality in front of us. So for me, like, I think the landscape is as much kind of overwhelming as it is beautiful. And I think sometimes my work has that beauty, but there's also this feeling of kind of being swept up in something. So certainly I think that thread of landscape painting, but in particular, the artists that were interested in kind of the emotive aspect of it.
Absolutely. I mean, the landscape and, whatever we put the capital N on the front of nature for is both overwhelming and it's ecstatic. I mean, it is the environment, the planet we live on, this thing that's a solar system inside of a universe. I mean, it's all very overwhelming, the power of it. And it's that I feel like what you're saying is like you're connecting to a lot of that while you're working, and it's always overwhelming. I mean, nature is overwhelming. It's way more powerful than we are. We're constantly trying to control it, and we can't. Well, we're running up on the hour, and I want to ask one last question before we go. And I think if you could respond to it maybe concisely without just jump into it, whatever your first reaction is. I think I don't want to pose it as a lighter question because I actually think it's very critical. Your artist's making work, you're making it for yourself, but you want to communicate, right? You're trying to connect with people in some way and tell them something. My last question is, what thrills you most about connecting people with your sculpture? Vaughn?
Wow, that's a tough question, actually. I
Go with your gut.
Over the years, I guess I just like sharing. There's a time that my ideas about art has evolved where I think that art is a gift in many respects, and I think that there have been times when I wanted to do a piece where, and it would be difficult, but do a piece where I do several little sculptures, paintings, and just have everybody come in and take one. Let them take the piece that they wanted and give the whole show away. And I wanted to do that just because conceptually that's kind of how I see art in some respects, as a gift, and having it stuck in the corner of my studio is not the way it wants to be.
Jose?
Yeah, that's an easy one for me. I think there's a very obvious moment when we go to an art fair and I have my work on the wall and I'm kind of trying to hide in the side, not let people know that I'm watching them, but I am watching them. Because it's an optical illusion, they see it from a distance, and there's going to be a moment where all of a sudden something clicks, and they see it, and they hadn't seen it before, and they're not going to hide that expression. And I'm familiar with what they're feeling, and it's a gift to be able to give that to them, to feel this, this sensation of, whoa, what is this? How, that
discovery.
Emotion,
it's discovery.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's
and,
great.
And it's kind of a reward also, because it's a big fair. You're kind of looking at things, and all of a sudden, because you paid attention and you sat there long enough, maybe a few seconds, it happened for you. So here you go. You got to see something cool.
That's great. Caryn, what about you?
I think the most exciting thing for me at the moment, particularly with the piece up at Catalyst, is that the audience kind of seemed to be enveloped by the piece. there was this sort of folding around them during the opening, and I think that there's something about scale and space that's just really interesting at the moment. Because I'm coming from this background of painting, we would all talk about the work. We'd all be at a distance from it as we were talking. And in the opening, we were all in the work, like literally it was folding around us. And so, I think I'm excited by the possibilities around scale and space at the moment.
Julia.
I think I'm most excited about just the concept of the group show, because a group show in general, the more that I work, the more I understand art making or having a platform for your art is really such a privilege in a lot of ways. And it's also kind of a disaster. And so seeing other people and being surrounded by other artists who, despite it all, still feel like they need to go to their studio and make the thing, I think is important in itself. So, that's what's keeping me invested right now, is being around other people who still all those small moves, those that object making is necessary to their own being.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, look, on behalf of Liz and I, we want to thank you guys for sharing all this information and feelings with us and insight into the work and the production. I just want to remind everybody that the Foundations of What is on view at Catalyst until March 4th. If you're interested, we will have this talk on our YouTube channel, which is at Catalyst Contemporary. And you can always connect to us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Our next talk for the second group of artists is February 25th, 5:30. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, thanks to all of the artists, not only for the work, but the conversation this evening. I really appreciate it. Bye, everybody.